I'm happy to welcome, we've seen them also yesterday, Mr. Professor Boris Otto and Mr. Hubert Tadieu, who will summarize what we have just heard and what that means for the other way ahead. Gentlemen, I hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Carmen, for the nice introduction, and I think it's a good idea to basically come back to the design principles which we have referred to over the last day and also earlier on in the session. And that is also the reason why we found it's a good idea to bring them up on the table once more. So talking about these design principles, it's important to note that we all embrace them when we talk about Gaia-X. And the first design principle relates to supporting policy rules derived from the requirements of the European single market. And it's important to stress that much of these rules basically relate to the notion of self-determination of the user, of the data provider in the end. But I should say also at this point that this is something that is also appealing not only for Europeans, but also all over the globe. And GDPR, for example, has been referenced quite a couple of times. And what we observe is that this taken up very intensively in other places of the world, for example, in Asia, but also in South America. The second design principle relates to supporting federated data infrastructure. We have heard also earlier on in many speeches. First of all, I'd like to stress the notion of federation. Well, I mean, in the end, that reflects reality, right? It's what we see, that basically computing power, AI is also distributed all over the place. And it's, of course, a natural fit to also build the infrastructure in a federated way. Talking about infrastructure, I think it has also come across that the infrastructure should be, let's say, fair in terms of access and use and non-discriminatory in that sense. And that brings us also to the notion of ensuring interoperability, portability, and sovereignty over data. And that has also been stressed yesterday and also in the presentations we recently heard. That refers to the entire value chain from the creation of the data over its pre-processing and then also to the use of the data. And that is also why Gaia-X basically consists of these two pillars, so these two layers of the X, right? Of course, and that is also something that we heard, that brings us to the point that we need to provide testable compliance to the Gaia-X architecture of standards. Let me also stress that the Gaia-X architecture per se will be, of course, technology agnostic, but then over, let's say, the notion of the architecture of standards will point to explicit specifications. But of course, the testability and the compliance and the validation of, let's say, services, whether they are adherent to the Gaia-X standard or not, is a big and important trust anchor. And lastly, I'd like to refer to the point that was also mentioned at a couple of times, the acknowledgement of an open standard setting process laid out in the internal rules of the Gaia-X Association. I should also say that openness of the process is pretty much important and also of paramount importance to the Gaia-X endeavor. Why? And that has also been stressed. Of course, we are striving for the competitiveness of Europe. And I think that it's very, very important that in this process of designing this architecture, we make use of, let's say, the resources, the best resources that we can get in the broadest possible way in order to come up with the best solution for this architectural design. And the second notion of openness relates to open source, and that has also been stressed a couple of times. So therefore, just a wrap up of the key design principles of Gaia-X, and with that, I'd like to hand over to Hubert.
Thank you, Boris. We would like to thank the top cloud service providers operating in Europe for their support to these 5 principles of Gaia-X. Their active participation in Gaia-X is an essential key success factor for our moonshot mission. I would like to come back on several points to bring some clarification. Several of you, including Microsoft, and I will use a statement of Microsoft, have said Gaia-X must include user controls that enable individuals and companies to choose for themselves where their data is processed and stored. It is important to remind that policy for localization, for instance, will allow users to specify where their data shall be stored, but we would like to insist it will be on the responsibility of the cloud service provider to guarantee that the chosen policy by the user is respected through an ex-ante compliance mechanism, meaning that the policy as described by the user should be reflected in the offering of the cloud service provider. We heard yesterday that this ex-ante compliance will also be critical at the data space level, and the representatives from Philips, Caisse des Dépôts et Consignations, Airbus, ask for compliant by design architecture, which will have to be endorsed by health, banking, or export authorities. And we have heard that several of the cloud service providers are already engaged in those kind of discussion with health authorities, with manufacturing authorities. That is very important. And we also think that this is demonstrating that the fact that we are operating at the two levels, the one of the infrastructure and the one of the data spaces, is an essential characteristic of Gaia-X. As well, data usage control, which has been mentioned several times, has to be fully transparent to users at their request. It will be probably something which will have to be checked afterwards, but gradually it should be more and more real-time check, which are offered at the request of the user. All of you required to contribute to the definition of policies, which will be done through the technical working groups in infrastructure, application, and data policies. That will be explained further this afternoon, but it is important to say absolute welcome to all cloud service providers to contribute technically to these policies, including the most advanced features that you have been able to provide. Some of you have mentioned, not specifically today, but in the discussion we have had with them, that great attention shall be paid to the practicality of the policies, especially because they will have to implement them in their offering. This is what I mentioned before, the fact that ex-ante compliance will have to be put in place by the cloud service provider themselves. As well, the update process shall be very clearly defined. The policy committee rules is in charge, the technical policy committee for policy rules is in charge of this task. Its members will be nominated by the AISBL Board of Directors, and we believe it is an essential element of the success of Gaia-X. In the ongoing discussion with European Commission, we have agreed to work jointly with the Commission to make sure that Gaia-X policies and the European Cloud Rulebook will be closely aligned. This is something on which a full agreement exists between Gaia-X and the European Commission. And to conclude this session, I would like to say that we are confident that the very nature of Gaia-X, which is mixing users and cloud service providers, is the right recipe to remove user reserves vis-à-vis the cloud and will help to increase cloud penetration in Europe from the current 26%, which is a proportion of processing which is done through cloud in Europe, to more than 50% in the next 4 to 5 years. We know that in the Nordic country, Europe is already at 65% of cloud proportion in terms of processing. So by doing together that exercise of creating the policies and the architecture of standard, we are conscious that we shall be increasing the size of the cloud market in Europe for the best benefit of the users, which will be able to transform fixed cost into variable cost, which is an essential element of the growth for Europe. So thank you for that session. Thank you for the cloud service provider who have been playing very straightforwardly the game we ask them to play, which is to speak to us openly and frankly about their commitment to Gaia-X.
Thank you very much, Hubert and Boris. And by the way, très jolie image derrière vous, Hubert. Ladies and gentlemen, see you back in a few moments.